3 minutes after 10 is the time. A very good morning to you. And I'll tell you one thing for nothing. I bet that Mark Carney bloke, you remember him with all his Project Fear nonsense about the economy? I bet he's feeling pretty stupid now. And Jacob Rees-Mogg will be doing a lap of honour for all of his myriad criticisms of Mark Carney's predictions of inflation and possible recession at roughly precisely this point in British history. His successor at the Bank of England, appointed partly, of course, because the newspapers wouldn't be able to castigate him as being anti-Brexit, appears to be having an absolutely disastrous time of it. But on the other hand, how do we know? I mean, you know things are going badly because inflation is rocketing and interest rates are going up, which generally means everything is going to get more expensive, including the money that you already owe, which means, all right, pause it, rewind, start again. Okay, I have a degree from the London School of Economics, but it's not really in economics. I mean, technically it is. It's got econ in brackets on the... I never picked up the certificate, actually, but if I had done it, it would have econ in brackets. And I think you'd be probably kind enough to agree that I'm not stupid. I may not be the sharpest knife in the drawer. I spent some time with Brian Cox this week, Professor Brian Cox, so you'll understand why I'm feeling a little bit intellectually inadequate, which is not something I suffer from often, but when I do, I really do. So I've sat down for an hour recently for the Full Disclosure podcast series with both the author Ian McEwan and the physicist Professor Brian Cox, and I probably at my humblest. Remember when Rupert Murdoch marched into that Leveson inquiry and said, "This is the humblest day of my life." This is probably the humblest week of my life when it comes to brain power. I doubt I've ever felt dafter than I do in the aftermath of sitting down with Professor Brian Cox and with Ian McEwan. Do you know, the only other person who really made me feel like that was Akala. I don't know if you've read his book, Akala. If you haven't, you really should. But Akala, when he talks about modern social issues, drawing upon an astonishing depth of knowledge regarding social history, it just makes you feel inadequate. It just makes you... So it's the opposite of the Boris Johnson school of pontification. It's knowledge and evidence-based, deeply detailed and profoundly scholarly. And it leaves those of us who perhaps rely a little bit on style and bluster to get through the day. It leaves us feeling, if we're honest with ourselves, deeply inadequate. But anyway, all of that is simply to stress, I don't want you to feel bad today if you are if you're in the category of people who are a bit bamboozled by everything that's going on, because I do too. I do too. I'm going to have a crack at explaining to you what I think is happening. I think the figures that you just heard Simon share, just Simon's bulletin there, reporting on what the Office of National Statistics is doing, are frankly astonishing. The percentage of adults, the millions and millions of people in this country who are already reducing their food expenditure, turning down their energy in preparation. I mean, already doing it when what's on the horizon is considerably worse than where we are now. And then, of course, when you turn thank you for all the compliments about my Australian accent. I am available, actually, as long as the rehearsals are in the afternoon and the performances are in the evening. I am available for stage work. I'm quite keen to get back into the old acting. So if you need anyone, cheers. I look at these stories, and I have two problems. One big problem here. No, Rupert Murdoch is not South African now, McNoodles, with your stupid messages. Honestly, one problem I've got, and I've mentioned this to you before, and I hope it doesn't sound silly. Almost all of us who will be reporting on this stuff, certainly me talking about this stuff, are going to be quite well insulated from the problems that we're talking about. So it sometimes takes the sledgehammer of statistics to really hit home how big a deal this is. Even front pages you can gloss over. Most people don't even buy a newspaper anymore. But when Simon starts listing there in his news bulletin the millions of people who, 24 million people, are already reducing energy use in their home between March and June. Here's perhaps an even more shocking one. 16 million people have cut back on food and, wait for it, essentials. Wow. 16 million people have cut back on food and essentials. That's nuts, right? But I don't know whether this is just me being a little bit of a worrywart, but everyone who's reporting it, everyone who's talking about it is insulated from it. And I think that creates a problem. I think that creates not a complacency, because the numbers are huge and important, but a sort of a lack of urgency, a lack of emergency. Look, if I was cutting back on food, if the economic situation meant that I was actually eating less or going hungry right now, as many of you may be, I think that the way I talked about it and the way I reported it would feel different to you. I can't convey the same sense of emergency that the 16 million people who've already cut back on food and essentials would be able to convey. And I do think it matters that Nadhim Zahawi, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is exceedingly wealthy, because I think it matters that I'm not badly off. I think it compromises my ability to do my job as honestly and as clearly as I would like. I think I can overcome that obstacle, largely because I get to talk to you every day. But I don't know that these people can imagine what it's like to be cutting back on food and essentials already and having debates in television studios about tax cuts, which most economic consensus agrees is the worst thing that you can do at a time like this. And I will try and explain what I think is going on. Before I do that, I'm going to read you stupid texts. This is going to take some beating. I get a lot of stupid texts from sort of masochistic people who can't help listening to the programme but hate what they see every time I hold up a mirror. And this is absolutely brilliant. Are you ready for this? Why is James criticising Boris and his Chancellor being absent when Bank of England Governor, spelt wrong, makes his statement yesterday, but at the same time forgetting to mention that his buddy Martin Lewis is on holiday as well? So private citizen and journalist Martin Lewis has gone on holiday. It's apparently equivalent to the two most powerful politicians in the country being on their holidays at precisely the moment the Bank of England announces that we're staring down the barrel of one of the worst economic crises in living memory. That is what footballification does to you. That is what happens when your Boris Johnson badge is stuck so tightly into your chest that you won't be able to get it off in a month of Sundays. Oh, private citizen journalist has gone on holiday. Ha! Ha ha! You shut up with your criticism of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer for being AWOL on a day like today. For the record, I don't think it matters that much. I think it's optics. I think we need to feel leadership. We need to feel that they care. We need to feel that the people in charge have actually got a handle on this and have concern about it. But in the context of this week or today and yesterday, there's not a lot they could have actually done. It just seems to me to be delinquent and derelict, to be absent. I mean, you may disagree. You may not care whether they're there or not if there's not a great deal they can do about it. But you'd certainly want to see the Chancellor of the Exchequer interviewed, I think, on television or on the radio at a moment like this in our economic history. I would. Not the Prime Minister. I mean, he's a busted flush. You wouldn't want to see him. In fact, if Boris Johnson turned up and promised that he was going to help, you'd probably pack all your belongings into a skip and move to the Isle of Man. I want you to tell me what you think is going on. I want you to tell me what you think is going on, okay? And I'll start. And I start from a position of never really getting it. And that's why I began at the beginning of this waffle by referencing my education, my university education. Because if a graduate of the London School of Economics can sit here on a day like today and think, yeah, this looks bad, but I don't really know how bad, and I don't know why it's happening, then you mustn't feel bad if you're in a similar position. And all of these front pages, I think, somehow create the idea that everybody else understands what's going on, but I don't. So you feel a little bit like, perhaps once again, we find ourselves in the role of the boy in the crowd with the naked emperor. Everyone else is sort of going, oh gosh, that's bad. The big squeeze on the front of the Metro, biggest loan rise since 95 as bank predicts recession, and the big squeeze on the front of the newspaper. Immediate hike in interest rates by 0.5% to 1.75, the biggest leap in 27 years, in an attempt to slow inflation. It's on the front page. Everyone else must understand what all this means. Guess what? I don't think they do. I think most of us perhaps have a bit of a grip on things, but not much of one. And the guys who write this stuff, it's their job. And they seem to come from a position. I often feel like this on budget day. I've got to be honest with you. It's when I feel most detached from journalism as a profession. On budget day, everyone's queuing up to talk about this and talk about that. But all we ever really notice is the price of beer and whether or not some Humpty's put a tax on pasties. We don't really understand, petrol and stuff like that. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm the only person in the country that doesn't understand this stuff. But here's what I want. If inflation is going up, you try to bring it down. Inflation is driven up by people shopping. So what you want to do, as I understand it, is create less shopping, right? Less spending. You create less spending to bring down inflation. Then you do that partly by increasing interest rates, because increasing interest rates means that if your spending is built on borrowing, and most of us got big mortgages or credit cards or whatever it may be, if your spending is built on borrowing, then higher interest rates means you're going to do less spending. And if you do less spending, that will drive down inflation. That's the economic calculation. The thing about economics is that it's not an exact science. Goodness knows, if it was, we'd all be in clover. What we have on the table now is two potential leaders, or certainly the Prime Minister most likely, the candidate most likely to become Prime Minister, essentially promising tax cuts, which increases our ability to spend. If we get a cut in our taxes, we will be tempted to go out and spend more money. That's what the bribe is, right? If I cut your taxes, you'll feel wealthier. Even if your social capital is being crippled, even if by cutting your taxes, I'm going to be crippling public services even more, because there's going to be less money for hospitals, less money for the police, less money for schools, less money for social care. I'm Liz Truss. I deal in unicorns, and I'm promising you a tax cut. So the woman who is most likely to be Prime Minister, I can't remember what Rishi Sunak's policy is at the moment, because it seems to change every 20 minutes. But I'll be across it by 11 o'clock. The person most likely to become Prime Minister is going to cut taxes, while the Governor of the Bank of England is raising interest rates. One of those actions seems to me to be designed to reduce our spending, discourage our spending. And one of those acts seems to me to be designed to increase our spending, which is absolutely bonkers. So whichever angle you're coming at this from, I think we need to begin by examining that paradigm that I've just described, because there will be people who perhaps think that raising interest rates doesn't discourage spending. I don't know. This is the point at which I start to feel stupid. That is the full extent of my understanding. And if my understanding is even close to accurate, then the current political climate that we have created, and again, it's obviously post-Brexit. The political climate is post-Brexit, not even mentioning the economic climate. Post-Brexit, we've created a political climate where they can just tell you that the moon is made of cheese and get cheered to the rafters, like our friend sending me texts about Martin Lewis. The cult is complete, really, and Liz Truss is the heir apparent to the cult leader, and she's going to sustain the cult's support and loyalty by continuing to make unkeepable promises and inflate ludicrous balloons and promise people the earth, while also promising to be really, really horrible to some recently selected minority over there, whether it's people in dinghies or, diversity trainers or the really, really important stuff at a time like this. And that is what I don't get. I don't get how these two things can be going on. You increase interest rates to discourage spending, and then you cut taxes to encourage spending. And we seem to be upon the brink of having a bank that does one of those things and a Prime Minister who does the other. Look, discuss. I'm happy to be stupid. I'm happy for you to pull apart what I've said. That's my understanding of the situation as of 10:18 this morning. I'm kind of hoping it'll be a bit different by 11 o'clock this morning. And I'm not embarrassed to tell you that that's pretty much the extent of my grasp of the issue. I've been blessed in recent years with the wisest best informed callers in the history of phone-in radio, and I'm hoping today you live up to your reputation. Let's get the phone lines open. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Because if I'm even close to being right, I think we should all be even more scared than the front pages today are telling us to be. It's 20 minutes after 10, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and nobody knows for sure. Remember my old geography teacher? And you ask him something that wasn't in the curriculum, and he'd say, don't know, nobody knows, don't need to know. Nobody knows for sure, however much they tell you that they're the experts. When it comes to the economy, nobody knows for sure. It's not like being a chemist. It's not like knowing what happens when you put copper sulfate in water, or when you, set fire to iron filings, or put iron filings in a Bunsen burner. It's not chemistry. It's economics. So nobody knows for sure. They'll argue with each other. The governor of the Bank of England will argue with the deputy governor of the Bank of England. One London School of Economics professor will argue with another London School of Economics professor. So we shouldn't seem so bad or feel so bad about not being fully au fait with everything. But I think we could probably together come to a better understanding of something. Couldn't we? Ian's in Livingston. Ian, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
The tee up for your audience might be, I'll certainly disappoint you, but I'll give it a shot anyway.
Go on.
The governor of Bank of England said that the inflation was being caused by the willingness of companies to be able to put up their prices, which is, to me, seems like, neoclassical economics taken to its absolute maximum.
Go on.
That they are always going to promote profits by companies to the expense of everything else.
Yes.
And that's the one thing that they will not touch consistently. So taxing.
You mean they won't put any form of brake or limit on the pursuit of profit?
Correct. So
Yes.
they're saying, commodity prices have gone up, right, that's fine. But you wouldn't expect them to make the maximum amount of profits that they're making just now. If they're taking a reasonable amount of profit, they're quite happy to milk everybody for everything that it's got.
Yeah.
So taxing, you're putting the inflation up, putting the interest rate up to affect people's spending ability when it's a commodity-based problem is not going to fix the problem. It just makes everything more expensive for people, and that's why
we've lived in this sort of neoliberal economic world for decades now. And so it doesn't quite hold, does it? Your explanation. These measures to discourage spending have worked in the past, even against the backdrop of rapacious profiteering by, most obviously on a day like today, energy and water companies.
Yeah, but then the amount of cash that people have had in their pocket has consistently gone down. Listen to the arguments that the union leaders have been making, where
that's true.
Pay rises have not matched inflation. They've not matched the cost of living, and therefore they're now at the stage, and you see that in the increasing amount of people going to food banks and so on.
So you're saying that the profits of big companies are a bigger driver of inflation than the spending habits of normal people?
Correct.
Oh, okay. And
because
is that? Forgive me.
If that was the case, you'd see high streets bursting full with people sort of spending on clothing and all that sort of stuff. But the high streets are a disaster.
I've started this entire conversation from the premise of my own ignorance, and I'm going to remain unembarrassed by it. So I'll ask a question that may make me sound stupid. Is this? Is this a well-established explanation that you've just shared with us? Does it enjoy a degree of consensus?
Probably not, because everybody's still talking about.
But did you?
Consumer.
Did you read it somewhere, or did you? Is it your own?
I've done some work
thinking
with. There's the UNFTR guys who are talking. It's you don't want to understand what the F is. It's whatever the Republic, which is just a bunch of US commentators, and they've got a reasonable economic grasp as well.
Yeah, fair enough.
And the experience of their research is that US companies are consistently, over the last few years, hiking their profits because they can increase the prices.
Yeah.
And nobody's challenging it. And it's what's happening here with the likes of BP or whatever.
Okay. Yeah, I'm getting it. I'm also understanding your discretion there when sharing those initials. It's a left-wing podcast of it's described. I think it describes itself as a left-wing podcast, although we're never quite sure what that word means this day. A political podcast. in America featuring all manner of experts and qualified people. And I think there must be some mileage in what you say for two reasons. Number one, it makes some sense of the situation in which we find ourselves. And number two, it's precisely the sort of theory that would be hugely suppressed by the current regimes in both media and politics. The idea that rapacious profiteering is more than likely a large part of the problems that societies are facing flies in the face of the politics of people like Liz Truss and the owner of the Daily Mail. I mean, it just does. I mentioned earlier in the little clip that they play out at 9:45 while Nick's still on that you probably shouldn't look at the numbers involved in dividends and profits for water companies at a time when they're telling you to grass up your neighbours for using a hose pipe. And it's being reported by environmental groups that 2.3 billion litres of water leaked last year alone. That's before we even get on to the excrement that is being routinely pumped into British waterways to their sometimes permanent detriment. So the companies that are doing this, the companies that are leaking 2.3 billion litres a year while pumping untold and unprecedented amounts of actual excrement into our waterways and of course our seas, they made profits of £2.8 billion last year. £2.8 billion last year. Rees-Mogg's latest ludicrous scheme is designed to address £180 million of putative COVID-related fraud undertaken during furlough and lockdown. £2.8 billion in operating profits. And in the last 11 years, how much do you think has been paid out in dividends to shareholders? That's money that shareholders in water companies get simply for being shareholders in water companies. They don't have to do anything else. They just simply get sent checks for being shareholders in water companies. And yes, some of those shareholders will probably be pension funds. They're not all going to be sort of chin-stroking Dr. Evil sitting in their mountain lairs or anything like that, and lots of them will be... But that's not the point. The numbers matter. How much in dividends in the last 11 years? £16.8 billion. And I'm not even going to go near, well, I will probably, but I want to get another call on first, what the people that run these companies are getting paid. That's one of the legacies of Margaret Thatcher that we didn't touch on yesterday, selling off all of the utilities and turning them into cash machines for people that care not a jot about the service that they actually provide. Jim's in Watford. Jim, what would you like to say?
Well, just, I was listening to your perfect kind of summary of, where we are in terms of, the whole kind of economy.
Yes.
Yeah, and one thing that you didn't cover was that Liz Truss actually wants to control the Bank of England.
She started making noises. Just today I noticed this. Page 2 of the Telegraph, I think it was.
Well, she actually started saying it last week, I believe, at the beginning part of last week, yeah. And the fact is that, if she wants to bring control, of the Bank of England, whereas the last 12 years of fiscal policy has been to say, actually, no, you have independence, you set the interest rates, you set where we're going and control inflation. Well, Pandora's out of the box on that one.
Yes. And
if she wants to bring more control in and then fuel spending, well, they just don't add up.
The independence of the Bank of England, I think it was it Cameron and Osborne that, no, it was longer ago, it was Gordon Brown, wasn't it, who brought it in? And
actually, it started with John Major.
Did it? And very simply, it removes the Bank of England from any suspicion that its economic policies are being driven by the political needs of the current government. You do not want economic policy to be set in order to increase the re-election chances of whoever's in Downing Street at the moment. You want them to be set for the long-term benefit of the entire economy, the entire population. So, I mean, I don't think that's controversial, is it?
Absolutely. Well, the fact is that the economy is raging because of bounce back, because the whole world has been, going through the pandemic. So everybody's looking for things. Everybody, the supply chain is fraught. So, that's why inflation is plus the whole fuel issue.
Yes.
They're the massive drivers. And, raising interest rates is only going to devastate those that can least afford it. And, we are one of the fourth or fifth richest nation, yet we've got the number of food banks is exploding, and it's just wrong. Why
are we in more dire straits, or indeed are we in more dire straits than comparable economies who have different models? I think mostly of sort of Northern Europe, Scandinavian, high tax but high public service economies. Are they better insulated? Are people there better insulated against this?
Well, I do feel that, but the fact is that we've just had fiscal incompetency, for the best part of, probably 5 or 6 years now, and it's just, one thing adds to another, and it just makes the explosion that we're in, so unpalatable.
But they have to increase interest rates, don't they? Or is that? I mean, most of the criticism I've seen today is that they've done it too late. Well,
you've got to look at what the drivers are, and the main drivers that's fueling the economy at the moment is production costs, which is fuel and energy is a huge element of that, and the fact that prices are rising because companies are paying over the odds to get hold of products so they can actually produce it to satisfy demand, and demand is there, and we've had
demand is outstripping supply because of the bounce back, which means companies are prepared to pay more than they've ever paid before.
Correct.
Simply to keep their production lines turning, and that means the costs in the shop are higher than ever before at a time when wages are stuck, and therefore, crikey, it's ugly, isn't it? I mean, there's going to have to be some pain. Does there have to be this much?
Well, there is going to have to be pain. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
And we've got boosterisms pursuing prime ministerships.
Well, that's another thing that just kind of compounds it all. It's just another thing that you kind of add into the mix. And if you think about where we are now, as a country, we've never been taxed as high as we are now.
No.
So tax and demand, demand was kind of naturally cooling because people have gone out and bought what they wanted. I mean, you see the explosion in people going out on holiday because, they've been grounded for kind of sort of 2 years. So, the fact is by using interest rate is quite a blunt instrument. But, I remember interest rates at, kind of 14, 15%, and what that actually did to the economy. And, I was shocked yesterday.
I'm late for the news. I'm late for the news. So I've got to crack on. And while you've been speaking, Liz Truss has pledged that if she wins, she'll hold an emergency budget, probably on September the 21st, that will bring in tax cuts. So I hope my analysis at the top of the show was wrong. The Bank of England is raising interest rates in order to discourage spending, and by the end of next month, Liz Truss would have cut tax rates in order to encourage spending. Someone please explain to me why that's wrong. I kind of need you to now. 10:32 is the time. Dominic Ellis is here now with your headlines. It is 10:35, and it is almost refreshing, but not exactly uplifting, to share a degree of confusion and or ignorance about the economic situation, because nobody knows. If it was science, if it was an exact science, then you would simply do X in expectation of Y, or you would add X to Y in expectation of Z. But they don't know. They tweak and they do things. Chancellors disagree with each other. Politicians disagree with each other. And crucially, economists disagree with each other. Richard Murphy, who is a brilliant communicator and for my money, a brilliant economist, has issued a very lengthy thread, which you may have read. I know a lot of you are telling me to read it, that offers up a completely different approach to the current crisis and offers up a very arresting description and analysis of the current crisis, which I think pivots upon one central point, which strikes me, looking at the numbers released by the Office of National Statistics today, as an eminently plausible point. We are heading towards a stage where millions upon millions of people will not be able to pay all of their bills, will not be able to pay their bills. And that will include, of course, energy bills, water bills. And what happens when that happens? And companies, of course, will go under, which increases unemployment. And Richard writes that unemployment is a much bigger problem for a population than inflation. We may talk to him, actually, although I would be amazed if he hasn't been on LBC at least once or twice already this week. But the idea that the Conservative leadership candidate is then being conducted on grounds that barely seem to recognise the reality of what the country is facing is, well, that is your perfect Brexit legacy, I'm afraid. If you're going to prioritise the colour of passports and intangibles like sovereignty and how you feel about foreigners over things like international trade, fiscal responsibility, evidence-based policy making, then you are going to end up in a whole heap of trouble. We'd still be in trouble anyway. If we were still in the European Union, we'd still be facing a lot of these problems, but they simply wouldn't be as big. COVID and Ukraine have created a hell of a lot of problems. So lots of other countries dealing with the aftermath and the impact of COVID and Ukraine, but not dealing with the idiocy of becoming the first country in the history of the world to impose economic sanctions on ourselves. And that's not an opinion. That is, as I often say, that is just counting. Jonty's in St John's Wood. Jonty, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, this is a bit of a what was it called? A Rubik's Cube, isn't it, of economics?
Yes.
What is absolutely for sure, in my estimation, is the Bank of England is totally incompetent, but not for all the reasons being alleged.
Okay.
And Liz Truss may be incompetent, but she also may be brilliant. I'm not sure which she is at the moment.
Right.
I'm no fan. But she's definitely.
It's not. I mean, she might be brilliant by accident because she's certainly not announcing tax cuts as a genius approach to the economic crisis. She's doing it to get elected.
But let me go through the Bank of England side, because your economic analysis was correct, but it was binary.
Yes.
In the sense, and binary on the one side. You've got, in very simple terms, you've got demand-induced inflation and you've got supply-induced inflation.
Yes.
And the problem is that the Bank of it is that economists have a bit of a groupthink, and the groupthink is you raise interest rates, inflation comes down, right? But it's not like that. This inflation,
it's not always like that.
No, correct. So, like, for example, the problem we had in the 1979-81 recession was it was both it was both sides. It was catastrophe. We had low demand and we had a sclerotic labour market dominated by trade unions, which meant that collective wage bargaining was very high, which meant that you couldn't have adjustments to the economy, and that gave rise to stagflation. Now we have a very different situation. There's two exogenous factors, outside factors, the war and COVID, that's induced the supply shock, and then our self-inflicted wound of Brexit, which has exacerbated it. And you can see it's exacerbated it because our inflation rate is not grossly higher, but significantly higher than other comparable nation states by probably another couple of percent, right? So what's happening is that the spending that people were making on non-essential goods has moved into essential goods because fuel and bread and food has gone up.
Yes.
So essentially, what interest rates normally do when you hike them, that's already been done through. It's a paradox. The inflation has already been, if you like, the behaviour.
Okay. Yeah. Right. So the crucial distinction is the one between essential goods and non-essential goods. So we've already stopped having takeaways in order to pay our electricity bills.
Exactly. We've already done that. So why induce that twice? Yeah. So what's happening in the groupthink is politically the Bank of England.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting. I'm being the sort of tribune of the people here, because I just need to even simplify even further what you're saying. So what they're doing is they're discouraging or reducing our ability to spend money on things that we really, really need.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really making an acute position even worse, right? And they're doing it. You see, it's groupthink. You see, politically, it's very difficult to stand there saying, "I'm a strong leader because I'm doing nothing." It doesn't really wash in our society.
Yeah.
We're addicted. We are a civilization addicted to action.
Yes.
But sometimes the most powerful decision you can make is to do nothing, and to explain why you're doing nothing. Because if you think about it from an inflationary point of view, imagine a world in which they do nothing. In 1 year's time, if petrol is right now £1.90 a litre, in a year's time, 366 days' time, if it's £1.89 a litre, then you've actually got deflation.
Yes.
So all we have to wait for is all these outside factors to wash their way through the system for 1 year, and statistically, we no longer have inflation.
It's a fascinating analysis. What? Yeah. So, I have to point out that it gives a bit of a free pass to the rapacious profiteering school of criticism, doesn't it?
Well, just move that to one side. Now move to Liz Truss, right,
okay,
and what she's trying to do.
Yes.
Now, first, I just want to correct something. She hasn't actually said that she wants control of the Bank of England. What she said, and by the way, it was Gordon Brown. He did it on his first.
He did it on his first day as Chancellor. I know it wasn't John Major, but I can't keep interrupting all my callers all the time, John.
First day in office, it was a brilliant move. It was a brilliant brilliant move.
Yes,
and
because it removes any suspicion that the Bank of England is making decisions based upon the political welfare of the inhabitant of number 11 or 10 Downing Street.
What Liz Truss is saying is she's being a bit waffly about it, unfortunately, and it's a bit scary, but she's not necessarily saying I want control. She's saying I want to review the mandate, which is totally legitimate. The mandate is the instruction or the parameters of instruction from the government to the Bank of England that you give to the Bank of England, and then you say, you get on with it. It's you're autonomous. It's a bit like once I've made an appointment, I've appointed the Bank of England governor, he gets on with the job. I give him a mandate, 5 years, he gets on with the job. That's what she's intimating at, but she's not exactly explaining why. And her tax increases, now here's the interesting thing.
Decreases.
What's that?
Her tax decreases. That she's
her tax. Yeah, thank you. So here's the really interesting point: is this only works if she plays, if you like, I'm not sure if it's an anti-Brexit or pro-Brexit card, but you see, the Bank of England's argument regarding inflation is they're trying to stop the metastasis of the outside inflation from the war, COVID and Brexit metastasizing into wage inflation, right?
Yes.
That's their theory. Now, I've never seen a worker go, interest rates are going up, therefore that impacts my expectation of inflation next year, therefore I'm going to change my wage bargaining. It doesn't work like that. Who thinks like that?
No.
What it comes down to is the fact that workers now do not have the wage collective bargaining power that they once had, therefore the labour market is unlikely to fuel wage inflation, therefore it's unlikely to become endogenous or homegrown inflation. Therefore, that's why I think the Bank of England's making a mistake. What Liz Truss needs to do is she decreases taxes. She then needs to open up. She needs to take the Brexit card and go, we have control over our borders. We're going to let double the people in.
Yeah, so we've got to, and there is talk of doing that. And in fact, if you look at NHS hiring, it's shifted hugely from the European Union to Asia and Southeast Asia because there is a huge shortage of people. And she needs people on the payroll in order to achieve what you've just described.
So James, what we need to
very quickly, Jonty, you've taken me out to the junction.
Okay.
Quickly.
Oh, yeah. Bank of England needs to stop increasing interest rates. If anything, reverse them. She needs to decrease taxes, and she needs to open the floodgates of the visa regime and let foreign workers in as quickly as possible and as frictionless as possible.
Interesting. And I mean, I guess the cultists are sufficiently brainwashed by now that they could be persuaded that was... What did I say? I said to you 2 or 3 years ago, they just need to bring in something called liberty of mobility. So whatever you do, don't call it freedom of movement. Just call it liberty of mobility, and we'll be golden. Jonty, thank you. I told you no one would agree about anything, and like you, Gabriel, Jonty did make my brain hurt a bit at the moment. But that's why I interrupt, just to make sure I understand, and I explain what I understand. When we get a caller like Jonty, who clearly knows his onions, it doesn't mean he's right. It just means he understands what's going on. He understands the disease. His prescription may not be the right one, but it was compelling. And then when I can interrupt and clarify, hopefully, Gabriel, it makes your brain hurt a little bit less. 10:46 is the time. 10:48 is the time. I'm just double checking I can't ask what qualifications are on a non-mystery hour day. Maybe I can, but I don't want to trivialise and judge people by their contribution, not by the certificates on their wall necessarily. I think Rishi Sunak might just have committed a fairly major boo-boo in Tunbridge Wells of all places. I'm disgusted. I wonder how old you have to be to get that rather weak gag. It doesn't really pop up much anymore, but it used to be that like newspapers would get letters from Disgusted of Tunbridge Wells about how awful the BBC was for showing pictures of ladies wearing skirts above the knee or something like that. I think Sunak might just have dropped an almighty clanger. I'm going to play you. Do you want to hear? Should we just find out together? Should we have a listen together and see if... Pardon? Yeah, in Tunbridge Wells, as I just mentioned 4 times. Here it is.
I managed to start changing the funding formulas to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding that they deserve. Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas. Then that needed to be undone. I started the work of undoing that.
You did what? Let's play. I remember Tunbridge Wells, one of the wealthiest parts of the country. Let's have another listen there, Rishi.
I managed to start changing the funding formulas to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding that they deserve. Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas. Then that needed to be undone. I started the work of undoing that.
Right, the kindest thing I can say is that he might be in the countryside and he's talking about redirecting funding from deprived urban areas into the deprived meadows of Tunbridge Wells environs. I don't think you're meant to say that out loud, Rishi, are you? God, those bloody Labour politicians pumping money into the poorest parts of the country. Well, I tried to turn that around so that you, sitting in a field full of Conservative Party members, a bucolic idyll. Is it in Kent, Tunbridge Wells? I think it's in Kent. Yeah, Kent's got some poor areas, hasn't it? Maybe he's sitting in one of them. He's just sitting in an orchard in Kent, saying it's areas like this that need the money, not those pesky poor people in inner cities. Right, once more with feeling, I think, because, let's have a listen.
I managed to start changing the funding formulas to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding that they deserve. Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas. Then that needed to be undone. I started the work of undoing that.
Wow. I mean, I guess if you're in Royal Tunbridge Wells speaking to Conservative Party members, it might be quite wise to tell them that you've started redirecting money in their direction and away from the poorest enclaves in the country. But I don't know that you should have let them get it on tape. Do you? Ho-hum, 10:51 is the time. Back to the economy. And here it is, because our last caller, very persuasively, John T., explaining why the Bank of England should do nothing or possibly even have reduced interest rates. I think Alex in Edinburgh is going to go in exactly the opposite direction, and no doubt Alex sound every bit as convincing, which is why this is such a confusing and baffling world for so many of us. What would you like to say?
Yeah, good morning, James. So I think that the Bank of England should increase interest rates further, and it should do it quite quickly as well. Basically, 1 year ago, £1 got you $1.39. In that time, US Federal Reserve has raised their interest rates quicker and faster than we have, and the result of that is today £1 gets you $1.21. The problem with that for us as a country, we import vast quantities of food, energy, raw materials, and goods, most of which are usually priced in US dollars. So if the pound falls against US dollar, then it makes it much more expensive for us to import these things. We are a significant net importer of everything except services. So if the Bank of England had raised interest rates quicker and kept up with the US Federal Reserve, the pound would be likely be in a stronger position. Therefore, the cost of us importing basic foodstuffs and energy would be lower.
I mean, it's one of the plates that the bank has to spin, isn't it? The exchange rate. And, I mean, you're right to explain the impact that would have on the exchange rate, and that would mean that everything that we're buying in dollars became essentially cheaper. But we've heard other explanations of quite large negative impacts of doing what you describe with regard to some of the other plates that the Bank of England is charged with spinning or keeping spinning.
Absolutely, but that's with complex issues. If by making one change you have a negative impact in other areas and a positive impact in different areas.
Yeah, but no, but the point it's not a complicated area. It's the simplest one of all. It's that people have already. I mean, let me remind you of the Office of National Statistics numbers. 26 million people have already cut back on energy bills. 14 million people, I think I've got those numbers right, have already, 16 million have cut back on food and essentials already. The more interest rates go up, the less money these people have to spend. And they've already cut the non-essentials out of their monthly expenditure. They're going to be absolutely screwed, Alex.
But if you increase the value of sterling, you make energy and food cheaper. So you're making essentials cheaper.
Yes, but you make them poorer. We've stumbled on it, haven't we? This is the absolute heart of the issue. You're right, and I'm right.
If you devalue the currency further by doing what the previous caller said, you will increase inflation, which will crush the poorest the most. Let's think about what the policy of low interest rates has achieved since 2008.
That's a good point. Who has
benefited the most? Yes. The rich, yes. The asset owners. What has gone up the most, what is the single biggest thing that has increased the most over the last 20 years? The cost of housing, both in terms of mortgages and both in terms of rent. And that is a byproduct of having these incredibly low interest rates for an extended period of time.
Yes.
The rich have got richer because of the financial policy of the central banks, which is printing loads of money and having low interest rates. And it's time we start correcting that. And unfortunately, that is going to mean for certain segments of the population, there will be pain, because unfortunately, we are in a situation where nobody is going to get out of this.
And that's what politicians are very frightened of saying. So, I mean, oddly, you and Jonty are completely at odds with each other, but he calls for inaction from the Bank of England. You call for more action. You call for an increase. The problem is that whichever path you go down, some people are going to suffer really, really, really terribly. And politicians are never really prepared, particularly not the current breed of politicians, are not really prepared to say that or sell that. They are constantly pretending that there's sunlit uplands just around the corner, or that we're all about to take delivery of unicorns, or that if you just trust me, all these problems will go away. And that's also what's frightening.
That's also a product of our population, unfortunately.
It is.
I think that
our media, the population that's been created by our media, perhaps, rather than the population per se.
So the previous caller also mentioned, if I'm correct, tax cuts and Liz Truss's policy of tax cuts. I have the opposite view and think that we should actually increase taxation.
But then what happens to the people that can't pay their bills, Alex?
But if you increase taxes, you increase...
I'm going to ask the question again.
And you can target support.
Right, fair enough. So people can't pay their bills. I mean, I think Richard Murphy's analysis yesterday suggested that essentials, as in, I don't think they're allowed to cut off your water now, even if you can't pay your bill. That needs to be extended into some other areas as well, and possibly even evictions. You know, you've mentioned property, but I'm not going to accuse you of being glib, because I thought that the length of the pause just then was very telling. You are possibly overlooking the personal impact upon millions of families of the policies that you might quite rightly be suggesting on a model, on a spreadsheet. They make the most sense.
How would cutting taxes really help people, especially poor people, because they pay very little taxes?
Yeah, and that's a valid point, but they pay, I mean, it depends what tax you cut, doesn't it? If you were to slash VAT, that would benefit poor people more, in fact, than a cut in income tax, as you know. But, I mean, the short answer to your... Well, I think so. If you make everything they buy considerably cheaper, then that's going to help.
Not really.
No? Everything that's got VAT on it? Down to 5% instead of 20%?
But let's think about this. What items do we pay VAT on in this country?
Yeah.
Pretty much no food has VAT. Children's clothes, no VAT. Books, no VAT. Energy VAT is already at something like 7%, but I would cut that. Compared to other European countries, what the poor pay VAT on is already...
I almost want to get you and Jonty in the studio on this, because I feel like an umpire at Wimbledon. Because, I mean, you are now making... And this is why I get so confused. It's why I opened the programme. I now understand both arguments that you've both made, but I wouldn't want to have to pick one of you to put you in charge. But I think perhaps the flaw in Jonty's reasoning was the one you've just cited, which is the people we are most concerned about, or the people I am most concerned about, the ones who are literally not going to be able to pay their bills and who have defied the traditional model of rising inflation because they've already curtailed their spending on non-essentials. Tax cuts aren't going to help them because they already pay very little tax. They already pay very little income tax. So Liz Truss is appealing to people who are less exposed to the economic crisis when she promises tax cuts. She's appealing to people who aren't actually, their pips aren't going to squeak, but they might have to make some minor adjustments. She's telling them your adjustments will be even more minor.
Absolutely. Yes. If you look at other countries, so countries that have lower rates of taxation, if you look at the US's bizarre tax policy, people there are quite poor. Whereas if you look at countries like Sweden, their population is much wealthier.
And the gap between the top and the bottom is much smaller as well, which I do think is relevant, although it's been missing from this conversation, and this conversation is now over because we're out of time. Thank you so much, both for listening and for ringing in. I mean, that's it, isn't it? You were listening to John T and you go, oh, yeah, this guy really gets it. And you're listening to Alex pursuing almost the polar opposite position. And you're thinking, oh, yeah, this guy really gets it. And that's why it would be quite nice to hear, I guess, give Nadeem Zahawi a minor break in that he's not going to be Chancellor, is he, next month? So it doesn't matter what he says about how he's going to fix this problem. But we talked a lot during coronavirus about the absence of clarity and leadership. Do you know who used the phrase clarity and leadership last night? You're not going to believe who used the phrase clarity. What was my catchphrase during the first 6 months of the coronavirus crisis? What was my catchphrase during the first 6 months? Clarity and leadership. Clarity and leadership, right? You're never going to guess who said it last night. In fact, I'm going to give the producer the length of this news bulletin to find it, and I'll play it to you after this. You're not going to believe me. Seriously. I don't know. I'm not suggesting for a minute that they've nicked it off me. But if one of the most, dare I say, effective, or certainly one of the most complained about by the government, critics of the government in the country, uses a phrase to describe what the government completely lacks, it's a little bit odd to hear a senior member of that government claiming that, well, judge for yourself.
Well, I think the answer to restoring integrity isn't introducing more rules, because we have endless rules and codes. The issue is about clarity and leadership.
Whoa! What? How dare you? I should get royalties. That's unbelievable, clarity and leadership. We talked a bit about rules yesterday with Fegan Murray, who's the guest on next week's Full Disclosure podcast. Fegan, as you probably know, the mother of Martin Hett, who was killed in the Manchester Arena bombing and is working tirelessly. It's an astonishing interview. She's an astonishing woman, although she won't thank me for saying that, such is her innate modesty. Working tirelessly to ensure that some good comes out of her son's death in a number of areas, chiefly in event management, if you like, or venue management. And of course, what she wants is more what people like Liz Truss would call red tape. Health and safety legislation, rules about bags being searched and metal detectors being deployed so that we don't see repeats of what happened in Manchester on that fateful night. It's so odd, isn't it? I've talked about it before. It really hit home yesterday talking to Fegan that when they say red tape, they're often talking about things that protect us. And when Liz Truss says we don't need more rules, it appeals to your inner schoolboy, right? It appeals to your inner Just William or Violet Elizabeth Bott or whatever your inner child looks like. But it shouldn't. It shouldn't. Rules are generally good. Most of the idiots enjoying a sort of dubious celebrity on social media and weird new television stations, they seem to never have got past being told by their mums that they're not allowed to eat Chewits for breakfast. They seem to they seem to resent. It's why they got such stress about coronavirus restrictions and came up with these astonishingly complicated conspiracies about how things weren't real or fake. Or it's as if they've never forgiven their mum for not letting them have Chewits for breakfast, and now anything that impinges in any way upon their absolute freedom to do whatever the hell they want. They don't think it should really extend to anybody else. That's the hypocrisy at the heart of what passes for their ideology, because they're very clear about whether or not, for example, footballers should be able to kneel, or people should be able to object to having a statue of the slaver in the middle of their town square. But for them personally, good God, how dare you tell me what I can and can't do? And then it extends into economics, and it's bosses who say, how dare you tell me that I've got to buy bloody hard hats for all my workers? Or one very prominent backer of Brexit's company just suffered an over £1 million judgment after a worker was very badly injured in one of their facilities. I just stumbled across that story yesterday and thought about red tape and regulation. It may not be fair to lump him in with the description that I've just had, but whenever business people tell me they want less regulation, it usually means less protection for workers in return for more profits for shareholders. And that leads us to the second conversation of the day, which is a little bit weird. In some ways, almost every conversation that we have at the moment is about how we've come to this. And the problem I have, and I don't expect you to expend much energy feeling sorry for me, it's world's tiniest violin territory. But the problem I have is, I mean, obviously repetition, but also being conscious, and I think perhaps increasingly conscious, of people who don't think it's important to ask how the hell we've ended up here, because people who don't think that we've got a problem at the moment or don't think anything's gone wrong, or people who still don't think that becoming the first country ever to impose economic sanctions on ourselves was a silly thing to do, or deliberately diminishing the power of our passport, for example. There are loads and loads of people still convinced, and I'm even going to avoid my usual clinging to the carcass phrase at this point, it's still convinced that these are not problems, or that the problems we are now beginning to acknowledge, and you know, when you've got the Daily Mail managing a front page attacking the governor of the Bank of England, who got the job partly, I think, because the government could be confident that the Daily Mail wouldn't be able to attack him for being a Remainer. You know, they're getting their people in all the top jobs now, and it's not exactly going well. But when you've got front pages describing imminent economic disaster, the Telegraph, recession to cause drop in record income. I haven't got the Mail in front of me, actually, but the Telegraph is generally as good as, isn't it? Families warned of very big shock to finances as inflation hits 4-decade high. The idea that we shouldn't be talking about problems, or we shouldn't be asking how it's come to this, is palpably absurd. Now, the bit where I wonder whether I'm biased is the bit where I can't help now turning to two stories, both quite prominent today. One we've already mentioned, one we haven't. You're looking at tales of, the worst economic scenario for ordinary families that we've seen in decades. According to the Daily Telegraph, which is to Boris Johnson what the Beano is to Dennis the Menace. And then I turn the page and I read about workers in Tilbury, Amazon workers in Tilbury going on strike because they've just been offered 35 pence an hour. You don't need me to remind you who owns Amazon. Well, maybe you do. It's a bloke called Jeff Bezos, who is worth squillions. A technical term, he's worth gazillions of dollars. Gazillions. I see a link. I don't know, maybe I'm mad to see a link, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. I'm more than 52% certain that there's a link between all of these things. If the richest man in the world, give or take Elon Musk, if the second richest man in the world, and he won't have this, listen, this hasn't crossed his desk, has it? No one's phoned him up and go, yo, Jeff, we got some workers in Tilbury, man, they want a pay rise. And Jeff goes, give them 35p an hour. I don't think that has happened. He's busy, going to parties and crewing his yachts around the world and all that sort of malarkey. But it's about the model that exists. About 800 employees took part in a sit-in at the work canteen in Tilbury yesterday and the day before. This is according to, wait for it, the trade union, GMB. One 24-year-old has vowed to continue the walkout, saying he's been working 6 days a week and eating one meal a day just to get by. Another insisted she would not back down despite being threatened with getting sacked, and she declared, I just need a proper salary. So I'm just going to Google Jeff Bezos fortune. And we are going to possibly see if we can use that New York Times article that tells you, no, that's too difficult. An employee would have had to start working in the Pliocene epoch to have as much money as Jeff Bezos has now. How long would it take a normal person to accumulate? A full-time Amazon employee would have to have started work approximately 4.5 million years ago to have as much money as Jeff Bezos. Right? That's a good one, isn't it? If you're an average Amazon employee in America, I think you're on more than these people in Tilbury, an average Amazon employee in America, to have as much money as the owner of Amazon has now, you would have to have started work 4.5 million years ago. Come on, call me a Marxist. Come on, call me a lefty do-gooder. That's absolutely right, isn't it? That's absolutely fair. And down with bloody unions as well. 4.5 million years you'd have to work on an average Amazon salary to be as rich as the bloke that owns the company now. And the company has just offered its staff in Tilbury 35 pence an hour. So now it would take 4,499,363 days for them to become as rich as Jeff Bezos, the owner of the company that's just offered them 35 pence an hour. And the world created by the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph thinks that it is somehow on the same side as Jeff Bezos, whereas the people who'd have to work for 4.5 million years includes them, but they don't realise it because they think that they're somehow better than the pledge. The median US household net worth is $118,200. Jeff Bezos has $172,000 million. Is that 172 billion? It is, isn't it? 1,000 million. It's a bit. He has about. So how does that compare? It is as if the average household in America has one peanut, right? While Jeff Bezos has a ton of peanut butter, a whole ton, in a truck. It is as if the average household in America has one white blood cell, while Jeff Bezos has the length of a finback whale. I quite like these analogies. I mean, I could go on forever, but I probably shouldn't. So we're looking at about $172 billion. So how does this happen? How does this happen? And I think a few of you are pointing out that would be 4.5 million years of work without paying any tax, which actually would be something they had in common with their boss. So they pay some tax. I better just correct that for the lawyers. But, I mean, these days when we look at stories like this, and you realise they're looking for a £2 an hour increase for their members. They've been offered 35p. You look at these stories, and some days I don't realise how bonkers they are until I get halfway through the introduction. This is one of those days. But then I'm haunted by the people who think that unions are their enemy. And I mean, look at what's happened with the rail strike. Look at what's happened with mooted industrial action pretty much every time it's reared its head in the course of all the years that we've been spending our mornings together like this. You know how easy it is. Throw open the phone lines. I said, throw open the phone lines. Just put my teeth in. And you'll be able to find someone who's there giving it large about how unions this and unions that. Jeff Bezos' net worth, I haven't checked this, Mark, so if you're yanking my chain, then it's straight in the sin bin for you, is roughly the equivalent of being given £233,000 every day since Jesus was born. £233,000 every day since the birth of Jesus. And then you get people, oh, well, it's all, I'm self-made. Oh, they work hard, these people. And anyway, I bet those people there got flat screen TVs, haven't they? 4.5 million years ago, they had flat screen TVs, didn't it? Hey. Oh, also, my neighbour, well, he was working in the Pilocene era, and he was moonlighting on the side as a window cleaner and not declared he was doing cash in hand. It's just incredible, isn't it? What we've created in this country. I don't imagine, I'm tempted to try, anyone's going to ring me and say it's perfectly right that Jeff Bezos is as rich as someone who'd been given £233,000 every year since the day Jesus was born, while his employees in Tilbury have been offered a 35 pence an hour pay rise. So what do we do? How do we do this then? How do we do this? I've got no idea, actually. I think for the first time ever, the chasm into which we are staring together, is too huge for me to touch the sides. And give me a ring and justify this. Come on. We're wasting both of our time. 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need. And that's his personal wealth. I don't even know what's the annual profit of Amazon. What do they make every year? That's his personal wealth. That's the money he's got in his current account. Look, metaphorically speaking. 18 minutes after 11 is the time. I think I just want to know, well, first of all, I'd like to know why. I do want to know why. I am going to touch the sides of the chasm. But the other thing I'd like to know is what's it like to work in an Amazon warehouse? 0345 6060 973. I'm not going to do the coma thing because that's got a bit tired lately, but I am going to do the alien. I'm an alien. I've arrived from a foreign planet, okay? Which reminds me, Professor Brian Cox is the guest on Full Disclosure this week. I'll play you a chunk of that later because it's an absolutely rip-roaring, scintillating conversation. I've just arrived from an alien planet and I've stumbled into a warehouse in Tilbury. And I've met some workers who've walked out after being offered, and they're all sitting on the grass outside the warehouse, refusing to go back into work. And I've assumed human form, right? Is it in Essex, this? Yeah, so, human form. And I've sat down on the grass with the workers outside the warehouse in Tilbury, and I've said, what are you doing, lads? Because I've obviously researched how to speak to people. All right, lads, I say, with my Tilbury accent now. I've done my Australian accent already. What are you doing? And they say, well, we're not working, we're on strike. We've had a walkout. And I say, why? And they say, because they've offered us 35 pence an hour pay rise. And I've done a lot of research. So I said, well, that's about 2%, isn't it? That's all right. It's more than some people are getting. They say, the bloke that owns this company is worth £272 billion. And he's offered us a 35 pence pay rise. So, question number one, how's that happened? 0345 6060 973. Question number two, is it relevant? Should we be comparing the conditions of Amazon warehouse workers to other warehouse workers, to other workers on that level? And the amount of money that the owner of the company has made from owning that company has absolutely nothing to do, and I mean this, I think this is an argument you might be able to make, absolutely nothing to do with how much warehouse workers in Essex should be paid. Let's open up the phone lines before I break the record for delaying the first junction of the hour. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Is this the same planet that Liz Truss is from? Asks Dave. Don't be cheeky. I mean, staggering. Another Dave, I think maybe having a go at defending it. He says Amazon has 1.1 million employees. 35p an hour across the company comes to more than £800 million a year. £2 an hour would be nearly £5 billion a year. Not an opinion, just counting. That's a good turn of phrase there, Dave. I might borrow it. Yeah, but it doesn't have 1.1 million warehouse employees. Jeff Bezos is an Amazon employee. Everyone on the board would be, or most people on the board would be an Amazon employee. All of the people working in the offices, the accountants, they're all Amazon employees. The very, very, very lowest paid people for Amazon are the ones that we're talking about here. And to be fair, $5 billion a year in a company that posts annual profits of over $14 billion is something that I can live with. Doesn't make me a communist, doesn't even really make me a socialist. But, say, I'll tell you what, Amazon, $5 billion. All right? $5 billion, the rest gets shared out, starting at the bottom among all your workers. You can keep $5 billion. And once all your workers have reached a certain level, then you can keep more. But no, I don't see a wage bill of $5 billion in a company with profits of $14 billion being a reason not to do something, even though it would be nothing like $5 billion in the context of what we're talking about. Sandy's in Ipswich. This is fun, Sandy. What would you like to say?
Wow, James, I've been waiting to come on to speak to you for such a long time. You've really hit on a subject that totally lights me up.
Yes, me too.
Yeah, it's disgusting. And it's become the norm, and it's become okay for greed to be good. And this all began, and I'm afraid I have to go back 40 years to Thatcher and Reagan and deregulation of the markets, and it has made the monsters of today, and it's made Jeff Bezos able to be the oligarch, the person with all this obscene amount...